Esotericism is said to be the habit of regarding knowledge as the property of the few, or the quality of having an inner or secret meaning. Such a disposition is frequently associated with the ancients and their separation of wisdom into an exoteric or open teaching and an esoteric or secret doctrine. The Institute for Hermetic Studies is proud to introduce founder and director Mark Stavish. What is alchemy, and why is it important to us?
Alchemy is the study of matter, energy, and consciousness. And what makes it important to us is that aspect where we talk about consciousness. We hear in contemporary science, as well as pop culture, the notion that the attitude of the observer affects the outcome of an experiment. And of course, the old wives' tale was, or saying goes, a watched pot never boils. There may be some truth to that. But in alchemy, which goes back really for millennia, I think we tend to focus mostly on ancient Egypt as the source of alchemy in the West, but it could go back much earlier, somewhere else possibly, lost in time. The notion of I, as a participant in the experiment, affect the outcome of the experiment, and it in turn affects me. It changes me. So in this way, matter is not dead or lifeless, but is part of a broader living landscape of the universe itself. And through it, we begin to understand who we are, our relationship to other living beings, and matter as a living being, and the cosmos itself.
You mentioned that alchemy is designed to answer two questions. One, who or what am I? And two, why am I here?
When we look at any spiritual practice, we're fundamentally asking these basic questions of who am I? And why am I here? These are existential. They have to do with our very existence. And alchemy is one way of doing that. And it is a very concrete way because we're dealing with very physical things. And as I've mentioned, as have many alchemists, it is a feedback loop that develops. There is an energetic exchange. And that energy is not value-free. It carries with it a certain frequency or wisdom or intelligence or information, if you will. Just as one radio station is different from another. They're all radio stations, but they each carry a different style or type of music. So as we deal with matter, and we deal with energy, and we apply our mind to it, and we become part of that experiment, we are changed in and through it. And it is changed in and through us.
Who was Nicholas Flamel, and what is his relationship to alchemy?
You know, ever since Harry Potter came out, what is it? It's going on over 20 years ago now, isn't it? The world has been introduced to possibly the most famous alchemist there is, other than Paracelsus, and that is Nicholas Flamel. And yes, Nicholas Flamel was a real person. He lived in Paris, and his house is the oldest building in Paris. You can see it, look it up online. And he and his wife Pernelle are said to have made the Philosopher's Stone. And his process of dealing with alchemy and making the stone has been known for hundreds of years and has been tried by many people, and people to this day undertake what is known as the Flamel path. It deals with antimony and, of course, changing the vibratory nature of this antimony so that it goes from what we would think of as an earthy stone to a lunar stone, and to finally this beautiful solar stone. And it is that solar stone which we see in Flamel's diaries, which he records. That is the red stone of the philosophers. So Flamel is real. Now, whether his story is real or not is up for each of you to decide by undertaking the path yourself and finding it out. But there are many wonderful stories and myths around him, even being alive to this day. And here we enter into a very particular and difficult area of anything that has to do with esotericism, is how can you tell truth from fiction? How can you tell what is a teaching story or what do they call it, a righteous fallacy from a simple truth, a statement of fact? And when we're dealing with folks like Flamel, we're dealing with what we call adepts. And from the esoteric perspective, these are a rare bunch of individuals. And rarely does one come in contact with them. And even if you did, how would you know it? That's the question I pose to people all the time who ask me about adepts. How would you recognize one? Now we see in the New Testament, Jesus says to his disciples, who do they say I am? You're this, you're that, you're that. You're John the Baptist, come back. You're this. Christ, the living Son of God. Now, Jesus never says this. He asks people, who do they say I am? So even amongst his close disciples, could they recognize his status, for example? So I think when we look at these other esoteric practices as well, and this goes across the board to any of the schools of yoga or Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, to Taoism, Kabbalah, how do you recognize what someone has attained? And it's with considerable difficulty unless you are within a certain proximity of it yourself. So when we're looking at teachers, we have to use a great deal of discrimination and wisdom and choose carefully. Because anyone who claims publicly to be a great adept, a great teacher, or a great possessor of the Philosopher's Stone, well, the rumor has it that they're probably not.
You discuss alchemy as an initiative process. What is initiation?
Initiation is a word we hear a great deal of in various spiritual circles, but it has a very precise meaning, and it has to do with something which is a beginning on a particular path of self-awareness or understanding. So a good way to think of a good way to think of initiation, in the alchemical sense, the Kabbalistic sense, or any sense for that matter, is that it is a series of progressive interior experiences. It is not random. It has a purpose. That purpose is continued self-awareness. So it is progressive. We continue to expand and learn more about ourselves. And it's interior. The experience of initiation is our own. Even if others share it, and even if we share our experiences with someone else, unless they have had that or a similar experience, they won't be able to understand it. So initiation is a stage of awakening that once occurs, there is no going back from. We do not regress from it. Just as once you learn how to read and write and do arithmetic, there's no going back. You're forever changed, and your own education is in your hands.
How does working with plants alchemically differ from standard herbalism?
Many people are familiar with herbalism. In fact, many people do it every day whenever they make tea or coffee. It's a simple infusion. An herbal product is steeped in hot water, and a tincture is made. We drink that tincture. Many people go to health food stores for various tinctures, some made with alcohol, and others made with distilled water or a combination of both. In plant alchemy, which we call spagyrics, is a technical name, we do the same thing. We take a plant, fresh or dried, and we extract its essence through alcohol, usually, and we make a normal plant tincture. However, the difference is for example, when you make your tea, you throw the tea away, or you throw the coffee grounds away. Same with that. The same with a plant tincture, you throw the herbal mass away. But in spagyrics, you take that herbal mass and you use it. It's said to be the body. And while the body is dead, we seek to resurrect it. And how do we do that? Well, we cremate it. Well, calcine is the technical term, but we burn it to an ash, a very fine, clean, white ash. and we add that back to the tincture. And if it's done just right, it will usually dissolve. That's the key difference. No part of the plant is wasted. Everything is utilized.
What is the Philosopher's Stone, and is it real?
When people hear the word alchemy, one of the things they immediately think of, courtesy of Harry Potter, is the Sorcerer's Stone, or the Philosopher's Stone, as it's truly called. And there are many ideas about what this is. Some say it is purely symbolic. It represents a state of awareness. Others say it is a tangible object, capable of transforming whatever it comes in contact with. Of course, here the notion is base metals into gold. I think if we look at the records, and both which are somewhat verifiable, I say somewhat because there's always going to be room for disagreement, and what is truly myth and lore that grows out of this, we can say that the Philosopher's Stone is most likely a physical object that is produced by the adept after they have achieved a certain level of inner awakening. And that inner awakening is where they are no longer separate from what we would call themselves. They have achieved a state of inner illumination or enlightenment. Not the final stage, but a very significant stage. And this provides within them a tremendous sense of harmony. This is very important, a tremendous sense of harmony, because it is through that harmony that allows them to have a positive effect on their own physical body and on their own mental states, but also a radiance that affects those around them and the environment around them. We see in the New Testament, Jesus is walking and he says, "Who has touched me? My virtue has gone out of me." That is an example of what we're talking about here, that sense that someone is so charged energetically that someone touches them and they are healed.
Is it possible to make the Philosopher's Stone in today's world?
I believe it is. And I say that from what I have been told by several people very close to me. And I do believe that it is possible. I think that it is tremendously difficult because the work itself is called the great work. It's not the big easy. If it were easy, everyone would have done it. Well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people would have. So I do believe that it is possible. And I believe that the Flamel path probably offers us the clearest and safe, being relative, extremely relative, one of the safer ways of approaching it. But of course, we have to understand too that the Philosopher's Stone is a state of awakening as well. It's principally the awakening first, then the stone second. So anything that allows us to awaken to that inner self, sometimes in some circles referred to our holy guardian angel or our inner master, anything that allows us to awaken to that is a progression towards that awakening, or that state which we would call the Philosopher's Stone. They are not inseparable, and that's very important. They are one and the same, because we ourselves then are transformed in that process.
What makes alchemy unique from other spiritual practices or methods?
People often ask, what is unique about alchemy? And for that, I will quote the French alchemist Jean Dubuis, where he said, alchemy is a path without any illusion. And what he meant by that is either you have, and here he paraphrased Paracelsus, you either have transformed something or you have not. So when we undertake many spiritual paths, because they're so interior to us, they're incredibly subjective. We ask ourselves, well, what is the objective measure of its efficacy that we know it's working? We look to our lives, we look to our relationships, and often when many people undertake a spiritual journey, they find that they're in shambles afterwards. And I jokingly tell people, I say, well, of course they are. You wanted things to change. Well, you got to shake things up before they change. In alchemy, when we're dealing with minerals, of course, we see the process clearly laid out. The object is in some way ground up. It is destroyed. It is tortured. Things are extracted from it. And then it is put back together again. And the same process takes place within us on some level. So we see in alchemy, when we're dealing with physical products, that either we have achieved the goal or we have not.
What role do dreams and intuition play in the alchemical process?
Whenever we undertake a spiritual path, we're often looking for certain signals or benchmarks along the way which let us know that our work is bearing some fruit, that our efforts have been worth it. One of the most significant factors is that of what we call lucid dreaming, or becoming aware that we are dreaming. The reason this is important is because it lets us know that we are awake within our own mind. And that's what illumination is. That is what enlightenment is becoming awake within our own mind. Now, of course, many people have had the experience of lucid dreaming, and then what happens? They realize they're dreaming and they wake up. So these practices help us to stabilize that state. Well, why? Well, it's so that we can dream more clearly, dream more profoundly. And what does that do for us? Well, it allows us to access deeper parts of our psyche, deeper parts of our being, which we often associate with various paranormal or psychic abilities. These are not abnormal, but these are just natural functions within our psyche, within our physiology as well. Among those is intuition. We see a greater awareness, a sudden clear knowing, as we call clairvoyance or clear seeing, of things that are about to occur or may occur in the future. Or simply, our lives become more harmonized. We're looking for something, we find it more easily. We need something to happen, it happens more quickly. Our lives in certain ways become smoother, easier, more harmonious. After a tremendous amount of effort and work, that is.
What is Kabbalah, and why is it increasingly popular these days?
Well, Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism. And of course, many people are familiar with it because of Madonna's association with it. And years ago, I was interviewed by Guy Ritchie for a documentary that he was doing. I don't know if it's ever seen the light of day, but I have to say it was quite the experience. He was quite well informed for the interviews, and I enjoyed it a great deal. I think with that said, people are familiar with it, in that pop culture kind of way. And of course, there's the red strings that go with it and all of that. And you find those in classical German folk magic as well. You find them in various systems of folk magic. In fact, within my own family, my grandmother, when she was young, her mother used to tie one to her dress before she would go out. And I would say, was that to protect you from the evil forces, or was that to protect you from boys, to make sure it was attached when you came back? And within that framework, Kabbalah, of course, has had moments of popularity. It's always been something that has attracted those interested in esotericism, though, because it is very intellectual. For a spiritual practice, it is very mental. It requires a great deal of mental fortitude and is very bookish. And that means that there's a lot of reading involved. In fact, I believe the Zohar, if I am correct, has something like 22 volumes. It's massive, and these are commentaries upon commentaries that we have. Of course, my edition is the concise one. I go for the smaller version. But we see all of this as a series of meditations on reality. And again, this goes back to, what is metaphysics about? What is spirituality about? It's about trying to understand who we are and why we're here. And these different schools of thought and the practices that have developed within them over the centuries, maybe in the millennia, and have been codified and worked out and have been systematized, are often presented to us in these very obscure meditation manuals and commentaries, such as the Zohar or the Sefer Yetzirah or the Sefer Bahir, or in the Corpus Hermeticum, or in the alchemical text.
Do you have to be Jewish to study Kabbalah?
Some would say yes. If not, of course, if you want to study strictly Jewish mysticism, there is a tremendous amount of knowledge of Jewish culture and religion that is required. As we've said, in the Renaissance, Jewish mysticism took on a flavor, which we kind of call a Christian Hermeticism or Christian Kabbalah, and also a Hermetic Kabbalah. So within those frameworks, no, you do not have to be Jewish, but they are not, as we would say, strictly kosher.
Is there a relationship between alchemy and Kabbalah?
When we look at Hermeticism, particularly from the Renaissance on, we see a close relationship between alchemical practices and other schools of thought. The principal school of thought that we will run into is that of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah. Now, of course, we will engage it in a very non-kosher level. We will see that it is really a Hermetic Kabbalah that we engage with. That is a Kabbalistic framework of the tree of life, ideas of cosmology and divine names, but we see it in relationship to very particular alchemical frameworks. So there is a distinct relationship between them, but at the same time, we can find, just as there are many different schools of alchemy, there are many different schools of Kabbalah.
What is the relationship between Kabbalah and magic?
We're often asked, what's the relationship between Kabbalah and magic? Because as I've stated, contemporary Kabbalah is related to traditional Jewish mysticism, but is often very different from it in certain respects. Traditional Jewish mysticism is just that. It is mysticism. It's about an individual having a certain personal and direct experience of the divine nature of the Godhead. Magic, however, is about the manipulation of forces, possibly even the connection or contact and exchange with intelligences or entities which we might call angels, or in some cases demons even, or elementals, or who knows what. Kabbalah provides a framework for a tremendous amount of magical practice, and always has, but that is not its main purpose. Its main purpose is one's reintegration, as we often call it, into the divine plan, if one wants to use those words, into the Godhead, into one's own understanding of their inner self. And as I've said, with that, it is not uncommon, as we've seen in various schools of yoga and other practices, for certain inner powers to naturally unfold within us. Some people like to take the path and look for those powers first. That's neither here nor there for me to criticize, as each path has its strengths or weaknesses, its pluses or minuses. But it must be understood that magic is the manipulation of those powers, those energies, for particular and specific ends.
During World War II, this was hidden. Can you elaborate on that?
You know, when we get up in the morning and we decide that we want to understand something like Hermeticism or Kabbalah or alchemy, and we open up our laptop and we sit there drinking our coffee, our herbal tincture of choice for the day to jumpstart us, and we Google search something or go to Amazon or Barnes & Nobles or whatever our bookstore website of choice is. We are inundated with possibilities and options, so much so that we may not even know what to pick. This is a unique blessing, the blessing of too much. What we need to understand is that it hasn't always been that way. And really, that's a very recent phenomenon. The study of esotericism, particularly alchemy, Kabbalah, and related sciences of Hermeticism, was very private. One had to be a part of the proper group or society, hence the notion of secret societies that now floods YouTube videos and History Channel shows alike. If one wasn't a part of the society, they may have been part of a family line. And some of those family lines existed in the United States dating back to the colonial period, and others were brought over later with families. And that's where mine came in. They brought over various traditions from Eastern Europe, particularly German-speaking Eastern Europe, that were in line with the whole Kabbalistic and Germanic Hermetic tradition of magic. Fortunately for us, after the Second World War, a greater opening occurred. We even saw correspondence courses. The idea that you could learn magic by mail or mysticism by mail. Think about it. I mean, it's borderline miraculous in a way. But people would often have to go on great pilgrimages and journeys and tremendous sacrifices. Now they could get for a very modest fee, would be delivered to their mailbox. Now it's even easier than that. You don't even have to wait. You can have the book delivered in a day or two, or have instant PDF downloads. The problem with that is we have lost the notion of what it means to work, or the effort or the sacrifice involved in bringing that to us. It's often treated as a commodity. And it wasn't so recently that studying these things and being a member of these organizations, whether it was Freemasonry or various Martinisms or Templar groups or Rosicrucian groups, was a death sentence. We see among the various revolutions that took place in the 20th century, whether it be the Communist Revolution or the National Socialist Revolutions, usually within the first year or so, or even the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the first things that are shut down are these organizations. Their leaders are in prison, their property confiscated, and their books burned. And I've personally corresponded with many people many years ago who experienced the occupation in Europe and what that was like to practice under those circumstances. And I've spoken to people who practiced under communism and how they were able to maintain their spiritual connection. So we are in a unique time right now, and it is imperative that everyone take advantage of it, because we don't know how long this window will be open. We are under the assumption that windows open never close. But seasons change and it gets cold outside, and we close our windows again. And that's where astrology comes in. It is about the cycles of mind, the cycles of life, the cycles of awakening. So for those who are truly interested in their path, now is a unique time to take full advantage of the opportunities that are presented to them, because there is no guarantee, as is with anything, that they will be there in the future.
Spiritual insight is often referred to as a breakthrough. A breakthrough to what, and for what purpose?
When we undertake different practices, people ask, what is this insight going to be like? And they often expect a flash of light. They want that Saul on the road to Damascus moment when they are struck down and blinded for 3 days and they know something happened. Or they have the great revelation and wake up and start making volcano models in their living room. They want to go off to the Midwest and look for the mothership. Generally, it doesn't work that way. The insights are slow so that they can be integrated into us, that they're progressive, as we said, so they build upon one another, and they help us better understand ourselves. It is a slow path. Sometimes, however, we do get traumatic breakthroughs. They happen. It happens to everyone in life, whether you're on the path or not. Something happens, and again, a trauma forces you to see reality as it is. And then how you respond to that decides the course and direction of your life. Spiritual practice accentuates that and speeds that up. That's why I often tell people, when you undertake the process, the path, whatever it is, get ready for your life to become difficult, not easy. You have to shake things up for a while. You have to get rid of the deadwood. You got to get the moths out of the closet. Take whatever metaphor you like. But if you like things as they were, you wouldn't be doing this. And there's things that you don't like and you don't even know what they are until they're out there. What we mean by out there, literally out there, something that is inside you is now out there, and you can put a name to it, you can put an image to it, you can understand, oh, that's what was going on in my life. That's what I don't want anymore. We see those kind of breakthroughs very often in the addiction community. That's when the true progress is made. So why should any of us be different? We all have our own addictions. Just because it isn't drugs or alcohol, as are the common ones, we have things, people, places, things that we have unhealthy connections to. We have thoughts, words, and deeds that are not beneficial to us. Only when they're out there, when we can identify it, can we make the conscious choice to now choose the direction we wish to go in. And that's really what spiritual practices are helping us do. It's helping us get all the goodness, if you want to use that word, all of our potential, to realize that. And it's also helping us to realize the things that are standing in the way of that happening.
With the failings of big government and mega churches, do you see people returning to a more primitive manner of finding God?
When we look at contemporary spirituality, we're looking at a wide range of subject matters. And with the explosion over the last, well, it's approaching 100 years really, but really since the 1970s, of occult material, of esoteric material, of a variety of profoundly rare and unique teachings being available so easily. Many people like to think that we've entered into this kind of golden age, and in a way we have. So the idea is that everyone will be practicing this. But that's not the case. Because not everyone is interested. Not everyone should. Should is a moral imperative. There's no reason someone should or ought to do it. They have to make the choice, not have a should placed upon them. When we look at traditional spiritual teachings, they're very important. They give us moral guidance, but they often fail in terms of giving us a method or a tool for inner realization. That's why people drift away from them. And in that drifting, they go to a kind of religious mysticism, as we saw classically what happened. And that's their first introduction to true esotericism, or inner practice. And that esotericism can lead them to, again, a initiatic experience of progressive inner awakening, such as Hermeticism offers, alchemy, Kabbalah, but also other schools. Will the masses undertake esoteric practice? Well, no. Because esotericism is not a practice of the masses. It is a practice of the individual. So, will more individuals undertake it? Possibly so, but the real question is, statistically, are more people doing it? Personally, I don't believe so. I believe if we look at statistically at the number of people, it tends to stay within the same narrow parameters. I'm okay with that. It doesn't matter to me. As long as people have the opportunity. If they have desire and the opportunity, that's great. If they don't have the desire, that's fine too. That's their choice. But if they have the desire and they have the opportunity through available courses, teachings, writings, books, seminars, conferences, those types of things, well, that's just wonderful. Then we truly are in a golden age, at least for them.
How do world events like the war in Ukraine affect the global consciousness?
In our lives, we have a variety of experiences, some of which are terribly unpleasant. We call this a crisis, particularly when it is sudden and unexpected. Even if others could see it coming, we may not have. So it's a surprise to us. It's a crisis to us. Even if we've lived our whole lives seeing other people go through the same experience, whether it be sickness or infirmity or death, bankruptcy, loss of a job, loss of those close to you, somehow we think it won't be us. We will escape that. When this happens on a larger scale to a community, or to a nation, or to the world in a sense, it shifts the consciousness of that community, of those nations, and to some degree of the world. So when we look at current events, natural catastrophes, war, famine, those spectacular four horsemen of the apocalypse that are always roaming the world at some point. I mean, it's not as if they're going to come at some distant point in the future like many people would like to think. They're already here. And they've always been here. And probably always will to some greater or lesser degree. And what happens with that is it forces us to realize that our time here is limited. What are we doing with it? What are we making of ourselves? It wakes us up. And some people, that existential crisis pushes them further on their spiritual path. Others, further away from it. So when we look at an event such as happening now in the Ukraine, many people look at it in terms of geopolitics, which is acceptable. Others will look at it in terms of metaphysics, which is acceptable. Some will look at it in terms of strictly military aspects, again, acceptable. Others, energy. But it's all of these things and more. And at the end of the day, for those of us, whether we're directly engaged in it or thousands of miles away in safety and speculation, we ask ourselves, why do we care? What does this mean? And it's because it shakes our sense of beingness. It causes us to question again who we are, why we're here, and what we're doing with our time. And of course, our mortality. So, well, what's hereafter? And of course, many people have tremendous spiritual crises. How does God allow this type of thing? It depends. It depends on your religious view, your spiritual view. Others will simply say it's karma. It's cause and effect.
Have you or your colleagues seen the signs of the Kali Yuga?
We see within conventional Western esotericism in probably the last 100 years, the infusion of different Eastern ideas. It started out primarily with Indian because those which are most accessible. It then began to include some Chinese, or particularly Taoist, mostly philosophical. And of course, since the 60s, a widespread infusion of Tibetan beliefs, such as particularly Vajrayana, but Tibetan Buddhism as a whole, and Bon recently. Within those systems is the notion of cycles, and one of the predominant ideas within it is the idea of the yugas, and the Kali Yuga in particular. The Kali Yuga is a time in which the situation of life is so difficult and so hard for many people that spiritual practice is almost unheard of. Therefore, any effort made at it has tremendous worth. Now, when we say life is hard and difficult, we don't simply mean in terms of basic survival needs. We mean there are tremendous distractions that keep pulling us out into the world, that keep us looking out there, over there, at this, at that, rather than looking within, which is, of course, what all spiritual practice should be doing, should be looking within, causing us to go within, giving us a means to go within. So there are many people who believe that we are in the Kali Yuga, or the latter stages of it, which has a certain amount of apocalyptic appeal to it for some. And the notion here is that as the material situation gets harder and harder, that people will be forced to make a decision about their path. And that some will undertake the spiritual journey and the path inward and will make as much tremendous progress as they can, and others will not. And it is, in a sense, a separating of the wheat from the chaff. But what is important here is that as individuals, each one of us is free to make the choice as to whether we will take that journey or not, and how we will take it. That's why we have such a thing as free will. And as we journey inward and take more responsibility for our lives, we end up with greater freedom. Well, how is that? Because we better understand the consequences of our actions. It's not just the psychic awakening or the ability to transformation or magical rituals or alchemical stones that are important. That would just make our lives a disaster without self-responsibility or self-reflection. It is the ability to know and to discriminate within our thoughts, our words, and our deeds, and understand what the consequences of them most likely will be. And in the Kali Yuga, people have tremendous confusion and distraction. So it's said that the number of people on the spiritual path is actually quite few. Now, the opposite of that is the Golden Age, when spiritual practice was tremendously simple and easy. But because there was so little opposition, it was hard to make progress. So the story goes, those of us born in this difficult time, this age of iron and death, as some call it, every little bit of effort bears tremendous fruit. So whether it's a good time or a bad time, which is a moral statement, all depends on your point of view.
How is it possible that so many people believe that we are in a golden age, and yet so many others believe that we are in the midst of the Kali Yuga?
Because they're not inseparable. They happen within the individual as well as the collectivity. So, when I look at my own inner awakening and the initiatic path, many aspects of that are a recapitulation of what we could think of maybe as historical epics, psychological development, even physical evolutionary stages. A variety of ways to look at it is my point. So when we look at a teaching, that teaching may be interpreted from one view. For example, the book of Revelations of John, the Apocalypse of John. Historically, it was viewed as a commentary on the Roman Empire at the time. Others viewed it as a prophetic text predicting an event in the future. Many people look at it purely as an initiatic text. Maybe it's all three. See, we have trouble dealing with complexity. We like to boil things down to something very simple. So if my life goes through a variety of cycles of awakening, and a community can go through cycles, and the world can go through cycles, so the book can possibly be all of them. But you see, my personal cycles, because I'm undertaking practices, are speeded up, as are with anyone else's who's undertaking practices. I mean, in theory, everyone, or close to everyone, will eventually become enlightened in 5 billion years if you don't do anything. I just make that number up, but you get the idea. When you undertake the path, suddenly it's, well, how long will this take? 5 years, 20 years, what? What? We speak in terms of lifetimes. Now, of course, the notion of reincarnation is deeply embedded in most of these practices, even in the ones I spoke about earlier, Kabbalah and alchemy. So, how can we be experiencing both the Golden Age and the Age of Dregs and Darkness? Well, it's very simple. Because they're always there. It's just a matter of how strongly they're there. To someone living in a war zone, they're in a hell realm. To someone living in Los Angeles, they're in a God realm. And many people, they're hungry ghosts. They just want more and more and can never be satisfied.